1144, the Crusader states of the Holy Land are in peril. Edessa, captured by the First Crusade back in 1098, falls to the undefeated warrior chieftain, Zengi. The Crusader states dispatch appeals for help to the Latin Christian kingdoms of Europe. There, the cause is taken up by Bernard of Clairvaux, the mid-12th century's most influential churchman. Bernard goes before the King of France, Louis VII, and the Emperor of Germany, Conrad III, and urges them to lead their armies east for the deliverance of the holy places. For the first time in half a century, Latin Europe is mobilized, and warriors come forward in great numbers, vowing to crusade. But the campaign grows into something far larger than even Saint Bernard initially imagined. In the Iberian Peninsula, King Alfonso I of Portugal and King Alfonso VII of León-Castile asked that the crusade be extended to their battle against the Almoravids. While on the eastern frontier of the German Empire, Henry the Lion wants to lead a crusade against the pagan Wends. This is the Second Crusade, the first truly continental crusading effort of the Middle Ages. Join us for the full, powerful story. Guys, before we delve into the Second Crusade, I want to tell you about this outstanding new app I've been using, Blinkist. The Blinkist app enables you to understand the most important things from over 5,500 nonfiction books and podcasts in just 15 minutes. I jumped into the 5 a.m. Club by Robin Sharma. As a professional creator, the use of time is huge for me. The 5 a.m. Club is all about how early rising can maximize your productivity, creativity, and success. As you can see, I can navigate through the key ideas within the book with this helpful list on the side. Plus that, I can get the key ideas either as text or as audio. I love listening to podcasts while I'm working on videos, so this format is outstanding for me. Another similar book geared toward maximizing your potential is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, which is all about establishing and maintaining effective, goal-oriented habits. I hope you guys will check out both of these titles on Blinkist. I think you'll find a lot there that's helpful. And now they've got Blinkist Connect, which allows every Blinkist premium plan to be shared by 2 different accounts. There is no additional cost to you, and it's free for the person you invite as long as you're sharing it with them. So get started with Blinkist today. Use my link in the description to get 25% off Blinkist Premium and enjoy 2 memberships for the price of 1. I'll see you guys at the 5 a.m. Club. On November 10, 1143, near the city of Acre, in the Crusader Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, King Fulk and Queen Melisande were enjoying an afternoon hunt. As the royal party pursued a hare through the scenic countryside, the king held his lance and urged his horse to gallop faster. Suddenly, the king's horse stumbled, and Fulk was thrown from his steed and struck his head on the ground. The king's companions at once leapt from their horses to attend the injured Fulk. Queen Melisande, too, rushed to the king's side. As the queen held her husband's bloody body, it was clear to everyone the king was dead. Melisande was inconsolable. Although she and the king had butt heads early in their reign, they'd grown close over the years, and together they'd ruled the Crusader kingdom well for over a decade. Fulk had been a wise ruler and a capable military commander. He'd done much to bolster the kingdom's defenses. Many important frontier castles, such as the famous Transjordan Castle of Kerak, were constructed during Fulk's reign. However, Queen Melisande was a capable ruler, and her eldest son, Baldwin, was a healthy youth of 13 who'd been educated to one day assume the throne. On Christmas Day, 1143, the nobles, knights, and clergy of the Kingdom of Jerusalem gathered in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to witness the crowning of Melisande and her son, Baldwin III. The queen was expected to wisely guide the kingdom until Baldwin III was old enough to rule alone. However, for the kingdom's greatest enemy, the death of Fulk was a welcome event. The Atabeg Zengi, ruler of Mosul and Aleppo, had spent the past decade constructing a powerful state. Already he'd captured most of the Turkish-held regions in Syria. So rapidly and efficiently had Zengi expanded that the Emir Unar of Damascus forged an alliance with the Crusaders of Jerusalem to protect his own domains. Now, Zengi felt ready to mount a major offensive against the Crusaders. Zengi's reputation among his fellow Muslims was mixed. Ibn al-Qalanisi, a chronicler from Damascus, understandably held a mostly negative opinion of the great Atabeg. Famously, Ibn al-Qalanisi recorded Zengi's treacherous dealings with the garrison of Baalbek during the Atabeg's long war with Damascus. But when the fortress was in his hands, he violated his pledge and went back on his guarantee of security, owing to a personal grudge and irritation against its defenders, which he nursed in secret. He ordered all to be executed, and none of them escaped, except those whose destiny guarded them. The people were horrified at his action and at such an unheard-of breach of oath on his part. But for many of the Turkish warrior elite, Zengi offered the best chance of driving the Crusaders from Syria and Palestine. As Zengi's conquests increased, he gained the loyalty of many Turkish emirs and commanders, along with their warriors. Zengi was undeniably the most powerful single opponent yet faced by the Crusaders. Meanwhile, the two northernmost Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa, were near to war. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, and Jocelyn II of Edessa had long feuded over territorial disagreements, and now, with no strong king in Jerusalem to impose an accord between them, the two seemed ready to settle their differences on the battlefield. The shrewd Zengi was keenly aware of this. In November 1144, Jocelyn II was in the western part of his county with his best troops. Zengi gathered a large army of Turkomans from the Jazira between the upper Euphrates and the upper Tigris, a region that the chronicler Ibn al-Athir tells us had often been raided by Crusader forces. The Atabeg launched a surprise attack on the great city of Edessa itself. Edessa was strongly fortified with a large curtain wall and 45 towers, as well as a citadel defended by an internal wall. However, at the time, Edessa's garrison was lacking in troops, and the citizens had no leader around which to rally. The population was made up primarily of Armenian Christians. From Turbessel, Count Jocelyn II received news that his capital was under siege. At once he appealed for aid to his enemy, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch. But Raymond refused to help. Meanwhile, in faraway Jerusalem, Queen Melisande organized a relief expedition to Edessa. However, Edessa was short of time. Zengi's catapults hammered at the city, and his miners dug tunnels. At last, a huge section of the wall collapsed, and Zengi's forces stormed into the city. What followed was a brutal sack. Thousands of the city's inhabitants tried to get into the citadel, many of them trampled to death in the panicked crowd. Ibn al-Qalanisi says that the Atabeg's forces set to pillaging, slaying, capturing, ravishing, and looting, and their hands were filled with such quantities of money, furnishings, animals, booty, and captives as rejoiced their spirits and gladdened their hearts. The chronicler Michael the Syrian describes the clergy gathering in the churches, clutching to sacred relics, and saying mass until they were cut down by the invading forces. At last, Zengi ordered an end to the sack. He issued a decree through the city, commanding his men to cease their plundering. All those who had survived the massacre were allowed to return to their homes. 2 days later, Zengi promised the defenders of the citadel that their lives would be protected if they surrendered. The defenders agreed. It was December 23rd, 1144. Edessa, held by the Crusaders since 1098, was once more ruled by a Muslim prince. After the carnage had come to an end, Zengi found an old man who'd been stripped, beaten, and dragged through the streets. As it turned out, this was Basil Bar Surmana, the Jacobite bishop of the city. Zengi had the old man dressed and brought with honor into his tent. There, Zengi gave the Jacobite bishop some authority over the Christian population of the city. Zengi knew, to prevent the Franks from retaking Edessa, he needed to win the goodwill of the Greek and Armenian Christians who made up the bulk of the population. Michael the Syrian tells us that after the sack, Zengi's forces protected the Armenians and Greeks of Edessa. However, any Franks found within the city were immediately put to death. News of the fall of Edessa soon reached Antioch and Jerusalem. Many blamed Prince Raymond for failing to carry aid to the Edessans. The force sent by Queen Melisande arrived at Antioch, where they joined with Prince Raymond in an expedition against the Turks, but Zengi drove them back in February or March of 1145. There would be no reversing Zengi's conquest of Edessa. The Atabeg quickly mopped up all of the Frankish-held castles on the eastern bank of the Euphrates. In little time, the county of Edessa was cut in half. Zengi's capture of Edessa was of vital strategic importance. Now the Crusader states in northern Syria were far more vulnerable, with Antioch itself more exposed. However, Zengi did not immediately press his advantage against the Crusaders. Instead, he renewed his most cherished project, the conquest of Damascus, besieging the great Syrian city again in 1145. But Zengi's siege failed. With Edessa lost, the Latins of the Crusader states dispatched urgent requests for aid to the Christian kingdoms of the West. News of Edessa's fall shocked the Latin world. Messengers arriving in Germany, France, and other regions reported that Jerusalem itself was in peril. What was needed was another crusade, and immediately. Not since the Crusade of 1101 had a major expedition been launched by the kingdoms of the West, but now, with Edessa fallen, Pope Eugenius III prioritized the calling of a new crusade. On December 1st, 1145, the Pope issued the bull Quantum Predecessoris. The bull recalled the victories of the First Crusade and called on the knights of Christendom to emulate the deeds of their forefathers, to take the cross and lead a relief expedition for the reconquest of Edessa. The bishops and priests of the church spread the Pope's message across Christendom. The Second Crusade had begun. Pope Eugenius's bull of crusade recalled the First Crusade and the establishment of the Christian states in the Levant. It described the fall of Edessa as a threat to the Church of God and all of Christianity. The Pope insisted that the defense of the holy places in the East was the responsibility of Europe's knightly elite. Hailing from the austere order of the Cistercians, Pope Eugenius urged knights to shun finery, fur-lined garments, gilded armor, and hunting dogs and hawks. However, even for Pope Eugenius, political concerns at home slowed the mobilization of the crusade. The Pope wanted the crusade preached in France and Italy, but he was reluctant to see the ruler of Germany, Conrad III, take the cross, for the Pope needed the Germans to support him in his disagreements with the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. Meanwhile, in France, the 25-year-old King Louis VII expressed a desire to join the crusade, though his own nobles advised against it. Even the king's high counselor, Abbot Suger of Saint Denis, advised Louis not to get involved in the risky overseas expedition. Jonathan Riley Smith calls Louis VII one of the most attractive of the medieval French monarchs and describes him as tender-hearted and courteous, pious and serious, a loyal son of the church, but not weak. However, his power was geographically limited and dependent both ideologically and politically on the church. Louis is said to have been unconcerned by his poverty in comparison to other kings. He once remarked, "Here in France, we have nothing but bread, wine, and joy." Before he committed to the crusade, Louis wanted the opinion of Bernard of Clairvaux, whom the king was said to have often consulted as though he were an oracle. Revered throughout Europe as a living saint, Bernard of Clairvaux was the most influential churchman of the age. Pope Eugenius himself had been one of Bernard's monks and pupils. Bernard was instrumental in defining a new chivalry, a knighthood blended with spiritual vows in the form of military orders like the Knights Templar. A warrior's true calling, according to Bernard, was to renounce pride and wealth and commit himself to the defense of Christendom. For Bernard of Clairvaux, the crusade represented the manifestation of this ideal. Saint Bernard and his Cistercians fanned across France, preaching the cross. Bernard's surviving letters from the period contain some of the most powerful examples of crusade ideology. Bernard's ideas would shape the church's approach to the crusades for centuries to come. This age is like no other that has gone before. A new abundance of divine mercy comes down from heaven. Blessed are those who are alive in this year, pleasing to the Lord, this year of remission, this year of veritable jubilee. I tell you, the Lord has not done this for any other generation before, nor has he lavished on your fathers gifts so copious. Bernard cast the crusade as a gift from God, a showering of blessings upon the warriors of the age. He emphasized the idea that those participating were fortunate to be living in an era of unique blessings from God. Also, Bernard frequently referred to the Holy Land as Christ's lands, emphasizing the feudal obligation of a vassal to protect his lord's domain. If Christ's domain was in peril, how could a Christian warrior neglect to defend it? Louis VII took to heart Bernard's ideals and lived more like a monk than a king, shunning finery and dressing in poor garments, praying frequently and fasting. At Vézelay on March 31st, 1147, in a field outside the town, Saint Bernard preached the crusade much as Pope Urban had preached at Clermont half a century earlier. Attending were King Louis VII and his leading men. In a dramatic ceremony, Louis received the cross from Bernard. Most of the king's leading vassals took the cross as well. Soon, Saint Bernard ran out of cloth crosses to affix to the cloaks of newly avowed crusaders. The charismatic abbot tore his own habit into strips to make more crosses. Even Louis's queen, the beautiful Eleanor of Aquitaine, took the pilgrim's vow to travel east with her husband. In terms of personality, King Louis and Queen Eleanor seemed rather mismatched. Unlike Louis, Eleanor was extravagant and worldly, a lover of poetry and song, rich garments, and the finer trappings of court life. However, their marriage had been a political win, for Eleanor was the heiress to the vast, wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine, and her territories greatly enhanced the Kingdom of France. Louis seems to have been deeply devoted to his bright, lovely queen, though the experience of the crusade would strain their relationship to the breaking point. By November, St. Bernard was preaching in Germany, territory ruled by Conrad III. Riley Smith describes Conrad as shrewd, sincere, intelligent, pious, courageous, and hard-working. In the past, Conrad had expressed interest in crusading. Although never formally crowned emperor, Conrad was nevertheless ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and styled himself King of the Romans. At Christmas Mass at Speyer Cathedral, St. Bernard preached directly to Conrad, asking the ruler to imagine himself at the final judgment, approaching the throne of Christ. The Savior would name all the gifts he'd granted to Conrad: wealth, power, kingship, wisdom, courage, strength. Then, recalling that Conrad had refused the Crusaders' vow, Christ would ask, "Son, what more should I have done for you?" Conrad, the tall, brawny king of the Germans, wept openly. Kneeling, he proclaimed, "I am ready to serve him." Bernard received the emperor's vow to crusade, along with many of the great men of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor, two of the most important rulers in Christendom, had agreed to lead the Second Crusade. Earlier, on March 13, 1147, a large group of Saxon nobles and knights approached the Cistercian abbot and asked him to extend the scope of the crusade. They wanted to fulfill their crusaders' vow by waging war against the pagan Wends, who dwelt east of the Elbe River. The Saxons explained to Bernard that these pagans were a threat to the local Christians, raiding their territories and carrying God's people into bondage. Were Christian knights not called to oppose God's enemies everywhere, not just in Palestine? Bernard needed little convincing. He agreed, and at once asked Pope Eugenius to extend the crusade to Christendom's Central European frontier in the northeast. The Pope, who rarely refused one of Bernard's requests, approved the idea. Formally, the Second Crusade was extended to include a new northeastern front, where dwelt the pagan Wends. The Saxons who battled the Wends would gain the same spiritual merits as the knights who would travel to Syria. As it happened, the territory of the Wends was the most logical point of expansion for the Christian Saxons. However, Saint Bernard insisted that the object of the Wendish crusade must be spiritual. He forbade the Saxon crusaders from making peace unless the Wends agreed to be baptized. We utterly forbid that for any reason whatsoever a truce should be made with these people, either for the sake of money or for the sake of tribute, until such a time as, by God's help, they shall be either converted or wiped out. This is a striking condition imposed by Saint Bernard. In effect, the Saxons were to offer their Wendish enemies the choice to convert or die. This was the first time crusading included such a ruthless maxim. Riley Smith points out that Bernard appears to be contradicting his own words here, for in the past, the abbot had stated that conversion must never be forced. Traditionally, crusaders in both the Holy Land and Spain had not insisted on the conversion of their Muslim opponents, and had frequently made treaties with them. Indeed, the Crusader states would have been unable to function had they not dealt diplomatically with neighboring Muslim states. This shows the divide between an uncompromising vision and the realities of war and politics as managed by those who actually lived and governed on Christendom's frontiers. The Templars themselves would be masters of diplomacy and would make many treaties with their Muslim neighbors. The Wendish Crusade represented the start of yet another thread in Crusades history, the Northern Crusades, and quickly, the Northern Crusaders would learn to deal diplomatically with their pagan opponents as often as did other Crusaders. But the Second Crusade would not be limited to two fronts. King Alfonso VII of León-Castile sent a request to Pope Eugenius III asking that the Crusade bull be extended to include Spain. Alfonso had his eye on Almeria, held by the Almoravid Empire of North Africa, and the King of Portugal, Afonso I, was interested in crusading to conquer Lisbon, held by the Muslim Taifa of Badajoz. For years now, popes had been issuing crusade bulls for the wars against the Moors in Spain. In keeping with the tradition, Pope Eugenius extended the Second Crusade to include the Iberian front. The Pope went so far as to issue a separate crusade bull for Spain and Portugal specifically. Many Genoese sailors and men from southern France opted to join the crusade of King Alfonso VII. Those taking the cross in 1147 had their choice: Spain, Central Europe, or the Holy Land. The Second Crusade was, in effect, the first international project of the Crusades. But would this stretch the forces of Latin Christendom too thin? As the Pope's call to crusade spread across Western Christendom, events began to trend more favorably for the Crusader states in the Eastern Levant. In September 1146, Zengi, while sleeping, was stabbed to death by one of his own slaves. News of Zengi's death was welcome among the Franks of the Latin East. Inevitably, a period of instability arose within Zengi's domains as his two sons, Saif ad-Din Ghazi and Nur ad-Din Mahmud, clashed over their father's empire. Saif ad-Din established a power base in Mosul, while Nur ad-Din secured his hold over Aleppo. Hoping to take advantage of the situation, Count Jocelyn II assembled his troops and marched on Edessa. Briefly, the Count managed to reoccupy the city, though the citadel itself held out. However, when Nur ad-Din arrived with a large Turkish army, prospects for the Christians securing Edessa evaporated. Nur ad-Din's forces overwhelmed Count Jocelyn and his Franks, who retreated, suffering heavy losses. Nur ad-Din then massacred Edessa's population and razed the city to the ground, leaving behind a useless husk of the once splendid town. It was a tragic end to the city's life. No doubt, Nur ad-Din wanted to eliminate the possibility of the Franks retaking Edessa while he dealt with the conflict with his brother. This first and decisive act of Nur ad-Din foreshadowed his profound significance in the history of the 12th century East. Nur ad-Din would, in time, become the most important enemy of the Frankish Crusader states. In the Iberian Peninsula, the crusade was underway by early 1147, led by local rulers long accustomed to crusading. After the proclamation of Pope Eugenius's crusade bull, King Afonso I of Portugal had sent his brother, Pedro, to meet with Bernard of Clairvaux personally to discuss the recruitment of troops for the crusade in Portugal. Afonso of Portugal was one of medieval Europe's truly remarkable rulers. It was Afonso who established Portugal as an independent kingdom. Indeed, he was the first named king of Portugal. Early in his reign, Afonso had allied himself closely with the Knights Templar. The king even described himself as a brother in the fraternity of the Templars, indicating that he himself had become an associate of the order. Afonso granted the Templars important frontier castles in his kingdom, and from then on, the Templars would be key participants in the ongoing Portuguese crusade. In March of 1147, King Afonso assembled his troops at Coimbra and made a rapid thrust south, surprising and capturing the Muslim town of Santarém. With this rapid victory, Afonso now controlled the passage of the Tagus River. The great city of Lisbon was now isolated. Afonso was poised to launch the greatest campaign of his reign. Meanwhile, in April 1147, a fleet of crusaders departed Cologne. As they passed through the North Sea and the English Channel, they were joined by crusader ships from Flanders and England. This coalition was no small force, but altogether contained around 164 ships and 13,000 men. Cruising past northern France and along the western coast of the Iberian Peninsula, the Crusaders dropped anchor at Porto, where they met the local bishop, Pedro. The bishop had been expecting them. Indeed, some men in this fleet had already made arrangements to crusade in Portugal with Bernard of Clairvaux when the great abbot had toured the Low Countries. Bishop Pedro urged the Crusaders to join with his king, Afonso, in the crusade to conquer Lisbon. The bishop emphasized the meritorious nature of the war. Act like good soldiers, he told them, for the sin is not in fighting, but in fighting for the sake of booty. Though the fleet set out for Lisbon on June 28, there was still much debate among their ranks about whether or not to join in Afonso's crusade. Some crusaders opposed halting for the Portuguese campaign, for their ultimate destination was the Holy Land. But many were attracted by Afonso's offer, a treaty guaranteeing them a share in the city's plunder and trading privileges throughout Portugal. These privileges would be generational, and their sons would inherit them as well. Arriving at the siege camp before Lisbon, the Crusaders met with King Afonso personally. The leaders of the Crusader fleet were Hervé of Glanville, Christian of Giselle, and Count Arnauld of Aerschot. The king appealed personally for their help, repeating his offer and insisting on the sanctity of his cause. Afonso even promised to grant lands to any crusaders wishing to settle in his kingdom. Among the Crusaders, Afonso's greatest advocate was Hervé of Glanville, who appealed to his comrade's sense of honor. Hervé voiced his agreement that the king's cause was a holy one and reminded his peers of the wealth waiting within Lisbon for the taking. Hervé's advocacy won out. The Crusader coalition agreed to join with Afonso's army in the campaign to capture Lisbon. The king sent the Bishop of Braga to formally request the surrender of Lisbon's Muslim rulers. "You have held our cities and lands already for 358 years, said the bishop. "Return to the homeland of the Moors, whence you came, leaving to us what is ours." Not surprisingly, Lisbon's Muslim governors saw things differently. They accused the Christians of acting out of greed and declared their intention to resist with all their powers until Allah should determine otherwise.
A fire rages through the enemy.
The Portuguese Crusader coalition formally laid siege to Lisbon on July 1st, 1147. Afonso and his army blockaded the city from the land approaches, while the Crusader fleet blockaded from the sea. Afonso's men assembled their siege equipment and began to batter the walls with catapults and trebuchets. Six weeks passed. The Muslims proved courageous in their defense of the city. The Crusaders began to grow frustrated, but then the Christians intercepted letters from Lisbon's rulers. The letters were desperate requests for help to Abu Muhammad, the Emir of Evora, and other Moorish rulers, and described the desperate conditions of hunger and disease that prevailed within Lisbon. Encouraged, the Christians pressed on with the siege. The German and Flemish Crusaders continued digging mines beneath the walls, while the Normans and the English constructed an enormous movable tower with which to assault the city walls. Lisbon's defenders became so desperate with hunger that they began collecting refuse thrown from the Christian ships as it was carried in by the waves below the city's walls. Seeing this, the Crusaders began laying traps for their opponents, setting food out in front of the city, and then capturing enemy troops when they came out to collect it. Finally, the Christian siege engines and sappers caused the collapse of a very large section of the wall. One Christian chronicler described hearing the defenders cry out in anguish after the wall fell. At last, in October, when the Anglo-Norman siege tower reached the city's walls, the Muslim defenders sent a messenger to King Afonso to ask for terms. Lisbon surrendered. The Christian army made its triumphal entry into the city on October 24, 1147. Although the king allowed the Muslim defenders to leave with their lives, the city was sacked and many lives were lost in this violence. The Crusaders also captured the nearby fortress of Sintra to the west and the castle Palmela south of the Tagus River. Many of the Crusaders decided to settle in Lisbon, and one of them, an Englishman named Gilbert of Hastings, was elected bishop of the city. However, most of the German, Flemish, and English Crusaders would sail on to the Holy Land in February 1148. Afonso next launched a campaign to capture many of the nearby castles. Soon, all of Portugal north of the Tagus River and south of Coimbra was under the king's control. As a result of the Lisbon Crusade, Portugal's frontier was dramatically expanded. The episode represents a major development in the ongoing Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. The conquest of Lisbon was King Afonso's crowning victory. The 1140s were a time when all of Christian Iberia expanded southward, but Portugal's achievements were the most important for this period of the Reconquista, the most landmark development since the fall of Zaragoza in 1118 or the fall of Toledo in 1085. The fall of Lisbon would be one of the Second Crusade's most enduring legacies. Surely, such a victory is exactly what St. Bernard envisioned for the whole of the international multi-front campaign. While Afonso of Portugal was engaged in the conquest of Lisbon, Alfonso VII, the king of León-Castile, was waging his own crusade to capture the great port city of Almeria. Alfonso VII is an important and intriguing figure, and his participation in the Second Crusade merits some examination of his rise to prominence. He was the son of Queen Urraca of León and the grandson of King Alfonso VI of León-Castile, the famed patron of El Cid. Alfonso VII's father, Raymond of Burgundy, was a Frenchman, if that term could be used for this period. Raymond was one of those many knights from the land of the Franks who traveled to Spain during the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Such men found willing sponsors in the Iberian kings who employed them in campaigns of conquest in the Muslim south or in the desperate wars against the Almoravids. Thus, Alfonso Raimundes, as he was known, sprang literally from that mingling of the Frankish and Iberian legacies, in part generated by crusading and by the increasing religious unity of Western Christendom under the Latin Church. Alfonso was born in a troubled period for his mother's kingdom, when the rival kingdoms of Portugal and Aragon were on the rise, and the Almoravids of North Africa were at the peak of their power. However, under Alfonso VII, the great territory of León-Castile would once more be the dominant power on the Iberian Peninsula, and the ancient imperial dreams of Alfonso's forefathers seemed plausible yet again. The king played a key role in reducing the power of the Almoravids on the peninsula as he invested their castles throughout the Tagus Valley, steadily defeating and replacing their garrisons. Indeed, Alfonso styled himself Emperor of all Spain, an ambitious title never fully realized. Nevertheless, we can see in Alfonso VII the clear blending of crusading ideals with the dreams of Spanish reconquest. Alfonso VII quite deliberately asked the Pope to extend the Second Crusade to León-Castile. He also invited his vassals, Ramon Berenguer IV of Aragon-Barcelona and William of Montpellier, to join in the crusade, quote, for the redemption of their souls. Alfonso was both a crusader and a reconqueror, a self-conscious member of the greater project of Latin Christendom, spearheaded by the Pope in Rome, as well as an heir to the ancient dream of Alfonso the Great and the other early monarchs of medieval Spain. The House of León-Castile considered itself the authentic continuation of the throne of the Visigothic king Roderick. Alfonso VII may have been one of Latin Christendom's first rulers to become aware of Pope Eugenius III's plans to launch the Second Crusade. In 1145, one of Alfonso's most important counselors and magnates, Archbishop Raymond of Toledo, was in Rome when news arrived of the fall of Edessa. It wasn't Spanish rulers alone who were interested in extending the Second Crusade to Spain. The Genoese asked the Pope to allow them to fulfill their crusading vows in the conquest of Almeria. The Genoese viewed Almeria as a nest of pirates and saw an opportunity to both destroy an enemy and gain from one of the Mediterranean's wealthiest ports. Alfonso would need a naval ally in the enterprise, and so he welcomed cooperation with Genoa. King Alfonso VII's active participation in the Second Crusade began in 1146. That April, he assembled his army in Toledo. In May, he attacked Córdoba, captured a portion of the city, and obliged the Almoravid governor, Ibn Ghania, to acknowledge him as overlord. In August, the king returned to Toledo, where he met with his Genoese allies. By September, Alfonso and the Genoese had hammered out a formal pact. Alfonso would supply land forces and contribute 30,000 maravedis. Genoa would provide a fleet, troops, and siege equipment for the siege of Almeria. The Genoese would receive a third of all conquests and would have the right to establish factories and markets in Almeria. They would also be exempt from all tolls in Alfonso's dominions. Ramon Berenguer IV, ruler of the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona, agreed to participate in the crusade as well. The plan was to take Almeria in 1147 and then win Tortosa for Ramon Berenguer in 1148. The Genoese would supply the naval power for both campaigns. In November of 1146, Alfonso VII met with Count Ramon Berenguer and King Garcia Ramirez of Navarre at San Esteban de Gormaz to coordinate plans for the campaign. As in the Holy Land, the Iberian Crusade would be a multinational affair. But Alfonso did not rest. That winter, he launched an expedition from his southern frontier to capture the Almoravid-held fortress of Calatrava. In January of 1147, the king had full control of that castle, which was crucial for his upcoming campaign. He then returned to Toledo to take up the kingdom's normal business. Meanwhile, the Pope, Eugenius III, reissued his crusade bull, this time specifically mentioning Spain as a front in the Second Crusade. "The King of the Spains," wrote the Pope, "is strongly arming against the Saracens." Here, the Pope affirmed Alfonso's preferred title of overlord of the entire Iberian Peninsula. In the summer of 1147, King Alfonso VII joined with his ally, King Garcia Ramirez of Navarre, for an attack on Baeza, an important Moorish stronghold in Al-Andalus on the Guadalquivir. The two kings captured the fortress in mid-August. Having secured Baeza as a critical supply base, Alfonso and Garcia then led their troops in the grueling, dangerous march over mountains and desert to reach the Mediterranean coast. Arriving at the port city of Almeria, the two kings rendezvoused with the Genoese fleet and the forces of Count Ramon Berenguer. The Genoese fleet had already arrived back in July. Their fleet contained 63 galleys and 163 other ships, an impressive force. Alfonso had with him a modest but effective army of 400 knights and around 1,000 foot soldiers. Ramon Berenguer's force included a single ship and 53 knights. We must remember that armies weren't particularly large in the mid-12th century. Bishop Arnaldo of Astorga preached before the Crusaders, proclaiming, "Now it is necessary that each one confess himself well and fully, and know that the gates of paradise are open." In effect, he was saying that those who would fall in this battle would be martyrs. At the time, Almeria was a rich, thriving port. The city's population numbered around 28,000, with walls that contained some 79 hectares of land. The Almerian fleet was considerable, but faced with this imposing Crusader coalition, withdrew before the city was fully invested. It looked as though no relief was coming from other Muslim lands. The governors of Almeria offered Alfonso 100,000 Moravids if he would withdraw. He refused. On October 17, 1147, a week before the fall of Lisbon, Almeria surrendered. Alfonso's crusade had triumphed. It was the crowning achievement of an already impressive career, and not surprisingly, the king would tout this victory widely. The Genoese, too, were proud of their accomplishment, which they considered both economically and spiritually profitable. In 1148, the momentum of the crusade did not slow down. That July, the Genoese rejoined Count Ramon Berenguer along with the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller for an assault on the port city of Tortosa at the head of the delta of the Ebro River. To show the broad recruitment for these Iberian campaigns, William of Montpellier and Bertrand of Toulouse both brought forces to this siege, and some veterans from the Lisbon Crusade joined as well. Tortosa surrendered in December, and so the Count of Aragon-Barcelona had his victory from the Second Crusade, as did the kings of León-Castile and Portugal. Ramon Berenguer continued his crusading into 1149. That year, he captured the important cities of Fraga, Lerida, and Mequinenza, thus reversing the gains of the Almoravids after the Battle of Fraga in 1134. The whole of the old lands of the once magnificent Taifa of Zaragoza, where El Cid had once served as a mercenary to the emir, had now fallen to the Christians. The Second Crusade had been a resounding success throughout the Iberian Peninsula. It had expanded Christian territory from Tortosa in the east to Lisbon in the west. These were significant gains, which placed important cities in the hands of the Christians. Although the Almoravids had been in decline throughout the previous decades, the Second Crusade put a stamp on the collapse of the Almoravid Empire. Throughout the Crusade, the Almoravids had failed to bring aid to Iberian castles technically under their rule, and the remaining great cities of the Muslim South began to operate once more as independent Taifa kingdoms. By 1149, the Second Crusade was over in Spain and Portugal. The successes were unquestionably dramatic. Bernard Riley summarizes the territory gained. The Portuguese border had been carried permanently south from Coimbra on the Mondego to Santarém and Lisbon on the Tagus. The entire basin of the Ebro had fallen to Aragon-Barcelona in the east. León-Castile had cleared the whole of the plain of Castilla la Nueva of the Almoravids and had established a strong position in the upper basin of the Guadalquivir and Almeria. All three of the major Iberian campaigns received assistance from the Crusaders from outside of the Iberian Peninsula. Germany, Italy, France, England, and other regions and kingdoms all sent assistance to the Iberian Crusade. But how would the Second Crusade fare in other theaters, the Northeast, and in the Holy Land? We'll continue with our look at the Second Crusade by examining the Saxon campaign in Central Europe, the Wendish Crusade. As part of the Second Crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux secured papal sanction and crusade indulgences for the summer campaign of 1147 against the pagan Slavs, or Wends, who dwelt between the rivers Elbe and Oder. Historian Christopher Tyerman says that this decision set the tone for perhaps the most radical and effective association of crusading and territorial expansion. This was the start of the Northern Crusades, which would last for at least 2 centuries and impact every region east of the Elbe, along the coast eastwards and northwards to Livonia, Estonia, Finland, and the Gulfs of Finland and Bothnia. These expansionist wars coincided with the territorial interests of Christian Danish, German, and Polish princes looking to press east or north. Spiritual gains went hand in hand with gains in land, wealth, and power. Ultimately, the Northern Crusades would bring the pagan communities of the Eastern and Northern Baltic littoral into the realm of Latin Christendom. However, in 1147, all this lay in the future. At the time, it was a matter of Saxon Christian knights seeking to sanctify their war against the Eastern Slavs by the big event of the year, the Second Crusade. The idea of crusading in this region wasn't new, though it hadn't yet taken off. Back in 1108, the Archbishop of Magdeburg sought military assistance for the vulnerable Christian lands along the Elbe frontier, urging knights to come and help in the liberation of, quote, our Jerusalem. Including this region under the larger Crusades umbrella was a natural development. If Christians battling Saracens in Spain and the Holy Land received the Pope's endorsement, then why not the Saxons who fought pagan tribes? For the Saxons, the prize wasn't spiritual alone, but the wealth of new conquests. The Magdeburg Appeal demonstrates this quite plainly. Their land is the best, rich in meat, honey, corn, and birds. and if it were well cultivated, none could be compared to it for the wealth of its produce. And so, most renowned Saxons, French, Lorrainers and Flemings, and conquerors of the world, this is an occasion for you to save your souls and, if you wish it, acquire the best land in which to live. May he who with the strength of his arm led the men of Gaul on their march from the far west in triumph against enemies in the farthest east give you the will and power to conquer those enemies who are nearby and to prosper well in all things. Note the direct reference to the First Crusade. No wonder that the Northern Crusades quickly evolved into one of the most active theaters of crusading. Nevertheless, historian Erik Christiansen writes, "When the Saxons demanded to be let loose on the Slavs, they did so for good old-fashioned reasons, either to get submission and tribute or to seize more land. For the Danes, it was an opportunity for revenge and retaliation against the pirates and slavers, and for the Poles, a chance of intimidating the Prussians." But who were these tribes that were to be battled? Across the eastern frontiers and the pagan lands that stretched along the Baltic shore to the Gulf of Finland, the peoples were divided into numerous principalities, tribes, or extended family groups. The most prominent division was linguistic. Between the Kiel and Vistula dwelt the Western Slavs, or Wends. Among the Wends, tribal and political groups were sustained by a lively polytheistic religion directed by a powerful priestly class. Each region had its particular cult, with its own temples stocked with sacred images. The rural areas were dominated by territorial princes, but markets and trade existed in towns on the coast. Farther east, political life was less recognizable to the Latin Christians, more tribal and primordial. Among the Wends, one prince stood out as most capable of resisting the coming crusade, Niclot, prince of the Wendish Abbotrites. Niclot presided over the substantial Abbotrite confederation, which included various other tribes and amounted to a considerable military power. Niclot was aware of the preparations of the Crusaders. In April 1147, the Pope appointed Bishop Anselm of Havelberg as his legate for the Wendish campaign. June 29, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul was designated for the muster. The Crusaders were to gather on that date at Magdeburg. However, that June, Niclot launched a preemptive campaign. His Wendish army struck at the newly established German settlement of Lübeck. The Wends brutally devastated the Flemish and Frisian villages. In fact, Niclot's initial attack only further bolstered the cause of the crusade. What better proof that the Wends were an immediate threat to Christendom? Erik Christiansen notes that Niclot's attack stiffened the sinews of the assembling armies, for it made it plain that he meant to have his own again. The coalition of the Wendish Crusade was composed of a Danish force under the kings Canute V and Sven III, troops under Archbishop Adalbert of Bremen, and Duke Henry the Lion's Saxons. Warrior bishops would be a common feature over the history of the Northern Crusades. In mid-July, the Archbishop and Duke Henry led their armies into Abbotrite territory to besiege Niclot's newly built fortress of Daben. Meanwhile, from the north, a Danish army and fleet descended on the stronghold. Niclot and his Slavic forces resisted fiercely. Surrounded by marsh and lake, Daben was well defended. The Crusader armies were stretched thin. A Crusader force had to guard the Danish fleet at Wismar Bay. Early on, Niclot set his allies, the Rugians, to attack the Danish fleet by sea. While Niclot's troops launched a sally against the Danish forces outside of Daben, the Danish troops were isolated by the lake outside the fortress. And so, the Wends managed to devastate the Danes before the Saxons could bring help. This early mauling of the Danish contingent caused the two kings, Canute V and Sven III, to quickly cut their losses and withdraw from the crusade. Thus, the Christian coalition was greatly reduced. Undeterred, Archbishop Adalbert and Henry the Lion maintained their siege of the Wendish fort. As the Saxon troops ravaged the countryside, some of the nobles objected. One chronicler recorded their dismay. "Is not the land we are devastating our land, and the people we are fighting our people? Why are we destroying our own incomes?" If they couldn't conquer this region for the time being, the Saxons generally preferred to extract tribute from it rather than destroy it. But didn't this go against Bernard of Clairvaux' maxim? Ultimately, the siege devolved into a costly stalemate. Soon, the Saxons came to terms with Prince Niclot. The garrison of Daben accepted baptism and freed their Danish prisoners. Niclot restored his alliance with the Count of Holstein and agreed to pay tribute. Historian Christopher Tyerman describes this treaty as, quote, "a scanty fig leaf to allow the Danes and Saxons to withdraw." The Saxon chronicler Helmut of Bosau mocked the Wendish conversions as false. Niclot's rule remained strong, as well as his people's pagan religious system with its temples and priesthood, and the Wendish slave markets continued to circulate Danish prisoners. But the Wendish Crusade wasn't over. At Magdeburg in early August, the main army assembled under the papal legate Anselm of Havelburg, as well as 6 other German bishops. Albert the Bear led the Saxon Marcher Lords, and an imperial contingent under the abbot Wibald of Corvey was also present. Campaigning far from Daben, this essentially papal-led army fought its way some 100 miles deep into Wendish territory. Possibly preparing to assault the strategically significant island of Rügen, the Crusaders attacked Demmin on the river Peene. The Crusaders managed to overrun Maishoff to the south, where they destroyed the pagan temple. However, at Demmin, Wendish resistance was fierce. Once more, a stalemate developed. Once more, the Crusaders ultimately withdrew. Persuaded by some of the frontier margraves, the bulk of the German army now moved on Stettin in Pomerania. However, it soon became apparent that this town had already accepted the Christian religion, for the inhabitants hung crosses from the walls. The town's bishop came out to talk with the leaders of the German army. Chastened, the Crusader coalition duly withdrew. In his famous history, God's War, Christopher Tyerman notes that the Wendish Crusade, begun with such acclaim at Frankfurt and attracting recruits from as far afield as Moravia, Denmark, and the southern Rhineland, petered out in a failed Saxon land grab. While the Wendish Crusade of 1147 produced minimal results in the immediate, it set a precedent that would shape the history of the region. It was only the beginning. The Northern Crusades would continue. The lands of the Wends would be the first to fall. Ultimately, German, Polish, and Scandinavian crusaders would press farther east and north, deep into the Baltic, absorbing tribe after tribe into the fold of Christendom. Niclot had had his victory, but his descendants would one day be Christians. For the time being, the Wendish Crusade was widely regarded as a disappointment, especially when compared to the sweeping victories of the Second Crusade in Iberia. "We did what we were told, but it didn't work," wrote the abbot Wibald of Corvey. Famously, historian Eric Christensen notes, "On the other hand, if this campaign had not been undertaken as a crusade, it would have seemed fairly successful. It rounded off the Saxon occupation of Wagria and Palabia and made Prince Niclot a tributary and ally of the Saxons. It produced a certain amount of loot, freed a certain number of slaves, and suffered only one serious defeat when the Danes were driven back at Daben. It was only from the point of view of St. Bernard and the clergy of the Slav missions that the campaign appeared a failure. It was they who had decided to make the permanent conversion of the Slavs the main aim of the undertaking, and it's worth asking why they imagined that this could be achieved through a military campaign. Interesting comments from Eric Christensen, which open the door to further discussion and contemplation. This leaves us with the final theater of the Second Crusade, the Holy Land itself. What would happen when the King of France and the Emperor of Germany led their armies against the Seljuk and Zengid forces of the Eastern Levant? Stay with us for the full story. The Pope's Norman-Italian adversary, King Roger II of Sicily, wanted to capitalize on the energy of the Second Crusade. Roger already maintained a close alliance with King Louis VII of France, and so he offered his own fleet to transport the French army to the Holy Land. Roger proposed that, along the way, the Crusaders could further the cause of Christendom by subduing once and for all the Byzantine Empire, which Roger described as treacherous and unreliable. Since the days of Robert Guiscard, the Normans of southern Italy had long cherished hopes of one day conquering Byzantium. Over the course of the history of the Crusades, many Latin Christians had developed a mistrust of the Eastern Empire, which seemed to them a nest of double-dealing snakes, at best an unreliable and cowardly ally in the fight against the Saracens. A robust anti-Byzantine party existed at the royal court of France, and many of King Louis's advisors urged the monarch to accept Roger's offer. Louis, however, felt that he would need Byzantine support to prosecute his crusade. He also preferred to travel overland like the heroes of the First Crusade. Politely, Louis declined King Roger's proposal. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Emperor Manuel Comnenus was not at all happy about the prospect of a new crusade. He'd spent a great deal of energy cultivating an anti-Sicilian coalition composed of Venice, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Empire. He was also loath to see his peace with the Seljuk Turkish Sultan of Rum disrupted. Like all Byzantine emperors, Manuel was concerned that the crusade would ultimately be turned against his own lands. To secure his eastern flank, Manuel reaffirmed his peace with the Seljuk Turks and prepared himself to deal with the western armies that would soon descend upon his empire. The German army under Conrad III departed Regensburg in May 1147 and headed east. Accompanying the knights and soldiers were a great many civilian pilgrims hoping to visit the holy places. One veteran lamented this fact and stated that Pope Eugenius should have required civilians to stay home, quote, "For the weak and helpless are always a burden to their comrades and a source of prey to their enemies." The Germans marched along the Danube to Vienna, Hungary, and finally reached the Byzantine frontier at Branitz around July 20. The size of the German army is unknown, but it must have been substantial, for it moved quite slowly. A reasonable estimate would be between 7,000 and 13,000 on the lower end, and between 10,000 and 20,000 on the higher end. Small by modern standards, but substantial for the mid-12th century. Hearing of the approaching Germans, Emperor Manuel negotiated an agreement with Conrad. The Germans would refrain from causing trouble in imperial lands, while Manuel would provide supplies and markets for the Crusaders. As it marched from the Danube to Thrace, the German army kept good order, but once they reached Thrace, German discipline became lax, and there were violent clashes between locals and Crusaders at Philippopolis. There was another violent incident at Adrianople, but at last Conrad's army reached Constantinople on September 10. Here, the Germans found the Byzantine capital on full military alert. Despite the unruly march of the German army, Manuel was eager to maintain good relations with Conrad. The Byzantine emperor was worried that the German ruler intended to attack his capital. Torturous negotiations followed. However, Manuel's wife, Bertha of Sulzbach, was a relative of Conrad's, and the two rulers managed to maintain friendly terms. On both sides, there was mistrust. Many in the Byzantine camp believed the Germans harbored hostile intentions, while many of the Crusaders were suspicious of the Byzantines. Nevertheless, after a month camped outside the walls of Constantinople, the German army traveled on ships provided by Manuel across the Bosporus. Manuel provided guides and food to the Crusaders. Although some of the army's commanders wanted to remain encamped to await the arrival of the French under Louis VII, Conrad was eager to press on to Syria. As hindsight would prove, Conrad should have waited. The German army divided, one contingent led by Conrad, the other led by Conrad's half-brother, Otto of Freising. Otto's contingent took the coastal roads southwards through Byzantine territory, while Conrad's contingent proceeded southeast toward Dorylaeum and Iconium. For 10 days, Conrad's contingent made the grueling trek across the treacherous interior of Asia Minor. Food ran short, and discipline began to break down. From the hills, bands of Turkish horse archers stalked the exhausted Germans, picking off the weak or the stragglers. Unlike the army of the First Crusade, Conrad's troops lacked cohesion and proved ideal prey to the harassment tactics of the Seljuk Turks. The Crusaders failed to adapt to Turkish tactics, despite the presence of Byzantine guides. The famed historian of the Latin East, William of Tyre, would later accuse these guides of deliberately leading the Christian forces into danger. It was common talk, and probably quite true, wrote William, that these perilous wanderings were devised with the knowledge of the Greek emperor, who has always envied the successful advance of the Christians. It's true that Manuel wasn't happy about the crusade taking place at all, but would he have gone so far as to have deliberately sabotaged its progress? On October 25, near Dorylaeum, the site of a dramatic crusader victory in 1097, Conrad's army was ambushed by a substantial Seljuk Turkish host led by the Sultan of Rum himself, Mesud I. The Turks executed their trap brilliantly. An advance force of Turks appeared and drew the German heavy cavalry into an early charge. Pursuing the retreating Turks, the German cavalry left their infantry and ran right into an attack by a much larger Turkish force. The German cavalry was devastated, and the infantry was subsequently mauled by the triumphant Turks. German casualties were atrocious. Desperate, Conrad, Otto, and the other commanders ordered a retreat back to Byzantine territory. As the Germans struggled to withdraw, they were continuously harassed by Turkish skirmishers. The retreat turned into a total rout. The German rearguard was utterly wiped out. William of Tyre records the devastation. Our army, hemmed in on all sides, was in mortal danger from the constant showers of darts and arrows. They had no chance to retaliate or to engage the foe at close quarters, nor could they lay hold of the enemy. As often as they tried to make a counterattack, the Turks broke ranks, eluded all their attempts, and galloped off in different directions. The Second Battle of Dorylaeum was in marked contrast to the First Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097, when Bohemund and the other leaders of the First Crusade had held their forces together with tight discipline and dealt effectively with the Seljuk Turks. Leadership seems to have been a major factor in the German failure. Conrad proved unable to maintain discipline or to demonstrate the imagination necessary to achieve victory in the most trying of circumstances. Conrad himself was wounded in the head by an arrow during the desperate retreat. A starving, shattered remnant of the German army limped back into Nicaea in early November. Many survivors immediately abandoned the expedition, taking the first ships bound for the west. The German contingent of the Second Crusade, even before it had reached the Holy Land, had effectively ceased to exist. The bankrupt, hungry, and wounded rump of the German army could do nothing but accept the hospitality of the Byzantines and the French, who were now encamped around Nicaea. For Louis VII and the French army, the appearance of the defeated, badly depleted German host was an ominous event. Some of the French blamed the Byzantine guides for misleading their German allies. Conrad, however, placed the blame on himself, feeling that his own leadership had failed at the most critical hour. Historian Christopher Tyerman writes, "In truth, the German crusade foundered on poor intelligence, fallible logistics, inappropriate tactics, and over-optimistic strategy, as much as by lack of Greek support or the skill of the Turkish archers. From the rebellious, despised foot sloggers and pilgrims to the mounted elite, for all their numbers and weaponry, the Germans proved in all respects except courage, singularly ill-equipped for Anatolian warfare or the needs of a contested march." At Nicaea, Louis and Conrad discussed their next move. After the Turkish victory at Dorylaeum, Conrad commanded only a tiny force. Louis was now the main commander of the crusade, for if it were to succeed, it would be up to the French. Both Conrad and Louis agreed not to attempt another crossing of central Anatolia. Instead, they prepared to march along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts of Asia Minor, thus keeping within Byzantine territory as long as possible. Departing Nicaea, the Crusaders marched to Smyrna and then Ephesus, where Conrad became dangerously ill. At Manuel's suggestion, the German emperor sailed to Constantinople, where he was personally cared for by the Byzantine emperor and empress. A renewed alliance was established between Manuel and Conrad. When he was healthy enough, Conrad sailed directly from the Byzantine capital to the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. Thus, the German effort in the Second Crusade concluded in a dismal and costly failure. Christopher Tyerman points out that the Second Crusade was the first occasion for a Frankish king to lead a foreign conquest since Charlemagne. The Crusade emphasized Louis VII's sovereignty by associating the great magnates of France in a specifically royal policy. The Frankish contingent was the royal army, Louis VII's army. The Crusade was one of the most important projects of the king's career. Louis established relationships with leading men that in later years solidified the royal court as once again central to French politics. His chaplain recalls how at Verdun and Metz, where the king gathered his army in June of 1147, although the king found nothing there which belonged to him by right of lordship, he nevertheless found all subject to him voluntarily. Enthusiasm for the Crusade was strong throughout France, especially after the preaching tours of Bernard of Clairvaux. Considered a living saint, Bernard was a striking figure. Years of hard penance had made his body lean and almost frail, but there was a severe strength about him. His vigorous, powerful intellect was matched by a profound charisma and eloquence. He was both the most influential royal advisor of the time and the most effective public orator. The Cistercian Otto of Freising described Bernard as endowed with wisdom and a knowledge of letters, renowned for signs and wonders, and as being like a divine oracle. The Great Assembly at Vézelay on Easter Day in 1146, where Louis presided as king and Bernard spoke as advocate of the Crusade, provides an obvious parallel to Pope Urban II's preaching of the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095. Like Urban, Bernard delivered a powerful speech, but more important was the symbolism of the moment. The king made his public pledge to the crusade and appeared as its leader, with Bernard representing the church's full endorsement of the expedition. Here, Latin Christian society stood united. For centuries, commentators have criticized Louis VII for electing to lead his army via the land route across Asia Minor and into the Holy Land. However, at the time this was a reasonable option. The First Crusade had taken this route, and quite successfully. The power offering to transport Louis's army by sea was the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, a bitter enemy of the Byzantines. King Roger of Sicily had already asked Louis to join him in a campaign to conquer the Byzantine Empire. Louis had declined, but he may have been concerned that ultimately Roger wouldn't take no for an answer. If Louis placed the whole of his army in Roger's care, Roger may have used that leverage to compel the King of France to attack Constantinople. In addition, Louis's army of Frankish knights was more suited to an overland journey. Unlike modern commentators, Louis VII didn't know the future. His decision to travel by land made sense at the time. In another dramatic ceremony, King Louis VII and his court gathered at the great cathedral of Saint Denis on June 11, 1146. Here, surrounded by stained glass windows depicting the great heroes of the First Crusade, King Louis prostrated himself before the altar, kissed a relic of the church's patron saint, and received the oriflamme, the crimson banner mounted on a gold lance from Abbot Suger, and finally the pilgrim's script from the Pope. All three symbolized the initiation of the Crusade. Louis's army included many of France's great lords and magnates. Flanders, Soissons, Bar, Poitou, Nevers, Tonnerre, the Auvergne, Champagne, and southern Burgundy all sent contingents. Among the greatest contingents was the force led by Thierry, Count of Flanders, as well as southern French vassals to the king's wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, including Geoffrey of Ronson. The king's brother, Count Robert of Dreux, headed the king's core party. Eleanor herself was attended by a considerable party of ladies, and later poets would imagine them fantastically dressed as Amazon warrior maidens. The king's personal chaplain, the monk Odo of Doye, accompanied his master, and his chronicle is today one of the most important sources for the Second Crusade in the Holy Land. One notable feature of the Second Crusade is the virtual universal approval it elicited from the powerful institutions of Latin Christendom. Only Roger II of Sicily, the Pope's enemy, refused to participate. This is in contrast to the First Crusade, in which Pope Urban had to rely primarily on his own allies, the Northern French, the Provençals, and the Normans. The First Crusade had been called amid a bitter feud between Pope and Holy Roman Emperor. Now, half a century later, the Crusades had become an institution firmly accepted as the business of God. The Pope's prestige and authority had been greatly bolstered by the success of the First Crusade and helped the papacy win the investiture contest with the German emperors. Bernard of Clairvaux emphasized that God would secure victory in the Second Crusade. The First Crusade's triumph had been a miracle, said the saint, and the second would be another miracle of God. However, Bernard also emphasized practical aspects of the campaign. In his letters, he recalled the disasters of the People's Crusade led by Peter the Hermit in 1096. Bernard wanted his crusade to be led by competent military men to ensure a success similar to the First Crusade. The cost involved in mobilizing Louis VII's army is difficult to overstate. Many nobles bankrupted themselves financing their participation. Wealthy church institutions, especially abbeys, made considerable contributions. Meanwhile, in the Holy Land, the Knights Templar prepared for the arrival of the Crusaders and sent representatives to meet the French at Constantinople. After mustering at Metz in June 1147, Louis VII and the French army, numbering tens of thousands, crossed the Rhineland, reached the Danube in early July, and then followed the route of the Germans through Hungary. Historian Jonathan Riley Smith writes that Louis's army was amply supplied by the Hungarians, with whose king Louis was on good terms. Thus far we were engaged in play, recalled Odo, because we neither suffered injuries from men's ill will, nor feared dangers arising from the cunning of crafty men. However, from the time when we entered Bulgaria, a land belonging to the Greeks, our valor was put to the test, and our emotions were aroused. Odo notes that an agreement had been formalized between King Louis and Emperor Manuel of the Byzantine Empire ahead of time, but he insists that as soon as the Franks entered Byzantine territory, the Greeks, quote, stained themselves with perjury. Odo writes, here, for the first time, wrongs began to arise and to be noticed, for the other countries, which sold us supplies properly, found us entirely peaceful. The Greeks, however, closed their cities and fortresses and offered their wares by letting them down from the walls on ropes. But food furnished in such measure did not suffice our throng. Therefore, the pilgrims, unwilling to endure want in the midst of plenty, procured supplies for themselves by plunder and pillage. However, Odo doesn't entirely blame the Greeks, called the Byzantines today, for this situation. He writes, some thought that this state of affairs was the fault of the Germans who preceded us, since they had been plundering everything, and that the Greeks therefore fled our peaceful king. Unlike Richard the Lionheart and Frederick Barbarossa during the Third Crusade, both of whom would impose universal codes of conduct on their armies and meticulously keep all their men supplied, Louis proved unable to assert universal discipline over all of his contingents. Greek ambassadors kept Louis and the royal party well supplied throughout this portion of the march, but many divisions of the army were left to forage on their own, resulting in clashes with locals. After this ominous start, the French Crusaders finally reached Constantinople between September and October of 1147. Manuel had shown suspicion toward Conrad, but now he showered King Louis with favors. The emperor held a lavish banquet in the French king's honor, and personally accompanied King Louis and Queen Eleanor on a tour of Constantinople's churches and holy sites. Manuel provided abundant markets and provisions for the French forces, but Louis's ability to enforce universal discipline remained lacking, and some elements of the Crusader host continued their unruly conduct. The emperor even arranged a joint mass celebrated by both Frankish and Greek clergy to honor Louis's patron saint, Saint Denis, on October 9. Clearly, Manuel wanted to maintain positive relations with the French and went out of his way to avoid any rupture with the Franks. Louis, for his part, was entirely in agreement with Manuel's policy. However, within the Frankish encampment outside of Constantinople, not all of the French nobles and bishops agreed with their king. By now, it was common knowledge that Manuel had forged a peace with the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, and this appeared as treachery to many of the Crusaders. Many of the French felt certain that Manuel intended to betray them and tried to persuade King Louis VII to launch an attack on Constantinople itself, arguing that the capture of the Byzantine Empire would position the Crusaders to better aid the Holy Land. However, historian Thomas Madden notes that Louis absolutely refused to entertain the idea of turning his army against a Christian empire. Manuel's spies kept him informed of the debate among the French, and so the emperor exerted pressure on the Crusaders to cross the Bosporus, squeezing the flow of supplies, spreading false rumors that the Germans were scoring great victories in Asia Minor, and quickly assembling a fleet to provide transport. Louis agreed with the emperor, and between October 16 and 17, the French army was ferried over to Asia, safely away from the Byzantine capital. Now, Manuel sent messengers to Louis about an agreement of homage, which further agitated the French nobles. Ultimately, a pact was signed. Jonathan Riley Smith summarizes the agreement. The Crusaders made homage and promised not to take any place under imperial jurisdiction. In return, they were promised guides and supplies, and the Greeks recognized that they would have to plunder where provisions were not made available. However, Manuel refused to provide a Byzantine contingent to join in the crusade. On October 26, the French reached Nicaea, where they met Conrad III and German survivors fleeing from the disastrous Battle of Dorylaeum. This was a sobering moment for Louis's troops, who had been led to believe by Manuel that Conrad had scored a major victory over the Turks. From that moment on, according to Christopher Tyerman, the French campaign never lost a sense of crisis. Joining with the depleted rump of the German army, the French pressed on the road south. Thomas Madden writes, "For obvious reasons, the rulers decided not to venture into central Anatolia again. Instead, they made preparations to march along the Aegean and Mediterranean coasts of Asia Minor, thus remaining in Byzantine territory as long as possible. As they pressed on to Smyrna, the Crusaders found the local Greeks unwilling or unable to provide markets, and so the army was forced to forage for food. This provoked more clashes with locals, and indeed, the exhausted, battle-scarred German survivors still trickling in to join Louis's army experienced attacks by some local forces. Thomas Madden notes, "Rumors spread quickly that Manuel was attempting to weaken the crusade so that it could be crushed by his friends, the Turks." Lack of supplies was a major concern, especially with winter approaching. The cracks in Louis's discipline only widened as many contingents looked to their regional lords primarily for guidance. Unlike the commanders of the First Crusade, Louis was unable to maintain consistent cohesion during the march. Different units became widely separated from one another. Desertions became increasingly common as soldiers abandoned the march to seek out ships bound for the west. At Ephesus, the Crusaders met Greek ambassadors warning of a large Turkish army preparing to attack the French if they continued their march. The emperor himself, said the ambassadors, advised Louis and his troops to hunker down for the winter within Byzantine castles. This was useful advice, but as Christopher Tyerman notes, such intelligence hardly compensated for what later struck some Crusade veterans as Manuel's highly cynical policy. He had failed to provide an adequate flow of provisions or a large enough shadowing fleet to succor or transport the western host. Even if impotent to keep Turkish incursions down the valleys of Western Asia Minor from attacking the French, Manuel failed to encourage local Greek officials or citizens to show hospitality, welcome, or open markets. With the German army destroyed, Manuel's policy appeared less nervous and thus less supportive. His alliance with Louis now redundant. While not wishing the Crusaders ill, Manuel no longer needed to appear to promote their interests, especially if they endangered his own in Anatolia or northern Syria. Tyerman goes on. So, when Conrad fell ill at Ephesus, Manuel saw the chance to reverse his diplomacy, abandon the French to their fate, good or ill, and reconstitute the Byzantine-German alliance against Roger of Sicily. Whisking Conrad off to Constantinople by sea, Manuel personally tended to the invalid amidst generous hospitality that the German king must have contrasted with the dry, forbidding welcome he had received at Constantinople only 3 months before. Then he commanded one of the largest fighting forces ever sent from Western Europe. Now he returned a sick old man, nursing wounds to body, spirit, and reputation, only too grateful for any comfort offered. And so, the German Emperor, Conrad III, departed via a Byzantine ship for Constantinople to recover from his illness under the care of Manuel Comnenus. Meanwhile, Louis VII led the Crusader army onward, swinging inland from Ephesus, heading east over the Meander Valley. The Christian host was in for a lengthy, grueling slog of over 200 miles across rugged landscapes. Their destination was Adalia, a port on the southern shore of Asia Minor. From there, they could reach Cilicia, ruled by the Armenian Christians. Lacking the support of a Byzantine fleet, this direct overland march seemed like the logical course. However, it would expose the Christian troops to Turkish attack. As it turned out, the march was brutal. Turkish cavalry forces tracked the French column every step of the way and launched an attack on Christmas Eve when the Crusaders were encamped outside of Ephesus. In this minor engagement, the Crusaders successfully repelled the Seljuk forces. However, the Turks continued to track the progress of the Crusaders. David Nicole writes, Louis carefully arranged his line of march with well-armed knights in the front, rear, and flanks, while the vulnerable baggage train and the wounded remained in the center. They reached the treacherous Meander River Valley. Here, the Crusaders would have to ford the river, and here, the Sultan Mesud I of Rum had set his trap. Mesud divided his host, concealing the first part of the army on one side of the Meander, where it could attack the Christian rearguard as it approached the river. Meanwhile, on the opposite bank of the river, the second part of Mesud's army would block the advance of the Christians and attack them as they attempted to ford the waters. The Christians approached the river only to find the Seljuk army arrayed before them on the opposite bank. Thus, on January 1st, 1148, began the first major engagement between Louis's army and the army of the Seljuk Sultan of Rum, the Battle of the Meander River. Initially, everything worked according to Mesud's plan. As the Christian vanguard approached the river, they faced a hail of Turkish arrows, while their rearguard was suddenly attacked by the 1st Division of Mesud's army. However, the Crusaders managed to secure a ford, and Mesud's cavalry wasn't able to retreat in time. William of Tyre recounts the battle. At last they found the fords, and despite the enemy's efforts, forced a passage across the river and rushed upon the Turks. They killed many of them and took numerous prisoners. The rest turned and fled. The victorious Franks at once seized the Turkish camp, which was filled with spoils of the richest kind and supplies of every description, and by vigorous action made themselves masters of the farther bank. Crucially, the Frankish knights were able to engage closely before the Turks could retreat. As David Nicole writes, the attackers' withdrawal was too slow, and they were hit by a counter-charge, driving the enemy back with substantial losses. This victory boosted spirits in Louis's army and alleviated some of their supply problems. Although Mesud's army had suffered serious casualties and the loss of their camp, the Turkish forces remained intact and were fully capable of regrouping and attacking again. The Crusaders reached Laodicea on January 3rd, a region where Byzantine control was tenuous, and many believed the local governor was in league with the Seljuk Turks. Now, the Christians faced their most daunting challenge, the enormous mountain of Cadmus. Louis tried to maintain a sound marching order, for this is what had afforded him the victory at the Battle of the Meander River. Most of the cavalry marched with the vanguard, while the baggage was in the center, and King Louis himself commanded the rearguard. On January 8, as the Christian host struggled to surmount the treacherous path over Mount Cadmus, Queen Eleanor's vassal, Geoffrey of Ronson, commanded the vanguard. At some point, the vanguard became separated from the rest of the army. Geoffrey pressed ahead, searching for a suitable campground, either ignoring or being unaware of orders to halt and wait for the rest of the army on the crest. Meanwhile, the rearguard paused to guard the foot of the pass, intending to march on the next day. This left the vulnerable and cumbersome baggage train almost unguarded as it moved over the mountain. Sultan Mesud seized this opportunity. Occupying the crest of the pass, Mesud dispatched forces to assail the Christian baggage train, which was strung out to almost 10 kilometers on the treacherous mountain path. Louis's chaplain, Odo, was with the baggage train when the Turks initially struck. Panic spread across the center column. Odo galloped to the rear guard under King Louis. When Louis realized what was happening, he at once rushed forward with his royal guard. But the steep terrain made it difficult for his horsemen to operate effectively. Fierce fighting followed. Louis's personal courage in the moment is admirable. Accompanied only by his household knights, the king managed to protect his infantry and non-combatants by charging the enemy. Most of the king's royal guard were killed at his side. Louis himself was nearly captured, and Odo provides a now famous account of the king's narrow escape. During this engagement, the king lost his small but renowned royal guard. Keeping a stout heart, however, he nimbly and bravely scaled a rock by making use of some tree roots. The enemy climbed after in order to capture him, and the most distant rabble showered arrows at him. But the king's armor protected him from the arrows, and to keep from being captured, he defended the crag with his bloody sword, cutting off the heads and hands of many opponents in the process. Since they did not recognize him and felt that he would be difficult to capture, the enemy thereupon turned back to collect the spoils before nightfall. In this case, Louis's unkingly appearance may have saved him. Under cover of night, the king, along with other stragglers, managed to regroup with the vanguard, which had returned to help defend the baggage column toward the end of the battle. The Turks had won a brilliant victory and inflicted enormous casualties on the Crusader army. However, the dogged fighting spirit of the Christians had averted total annihilation. The army remained intact. More than could be said for Conrad III and his forces. The French had suffered a defeat at the Battle of Mount Cadmus, but they had survived. Mesud I had shown himself a very effective general. Despite the setback at the Meander River, he'd picked the perfect location for his next attack and inflicted a serious defeat on his enemy. His victory at Mount Cadmus was as important as his earlier victory against the Germans at Dorylaeum. To avoid another disaster, Louis placed command of the army with the Knights Templar, led by their Grand Master, Everard de Bar. Over the course of the march, Louis had come to rely on the advice of the Templars, so now, in this moment of crisis, he naturally turned to them. Everard divided the army into units of 50, each subject to an individual Templar, each of which was subject to a general commander named Brother Gilbert. This new arrangement proved effective, though the army was already badly reduced after the defeat at Mount Cadmus. The Turks adopted a scorched earth policy, so that the land was all but devoid of plunder. By the time the Crusader army reached Adelia on January 20, it was hungry and exhausted. At this point, they found a Byzantine fleet too small to transport the whole of the Frankish host. To secure the basic food needed for survival, Louis had to again swear an oath of loyalty to Manuel before the local Byzantine governor. There were only enough ships to transport the king and the knightly elite of the army. Initially, Louis insisted that he would march on with the bulk of the army via the land route. But the upper ranks objected to this, insisting that the king must make all haste to the Holy Land with the army's best fighting units. Shamefully, King Louis allowed himself to be persuaded by these arguments. A general who separates himself from his troops does more damage to his cause than his enemy. Louis did just that. Boarding the Byzantine ships along with the other knights and upper ranks of the French host, the king left the bulk of the infantry and non-combatants to carry on overland. It's not known how many of these people ever made it to Antioch. Some of them didn't even try, electing to remain in Adelia. Some took service with the local Byzantine garrison. Some, according to the chaplain Odo, even took service with the Sultan of Rum, who did not require them to renounce Christianity. Of those that did attempt to march overland, many fell in the hills to the arrows of Turkish horsemen. Only a very few finally made it to Antioch. Years later, Richard the Lionheart would avoid all these problems by carefully contracting and organizing his own fleet for the journey to the Holy Land. Louis here was at the mercy of forces beyond his control. After surviving the brutal march across Asia Minor, his army was ultimately broken up by poor logistics. News of the victories of the Sultan of Rum spread throughout the Muslim world. The Zengid chronicler Ibn al-Athir provides a good sense of how the Muslim world perceived the initial stages of the Crusade. This year, the king of the Germans came from his lands with a great host and a large following of Franks, aiming to attack Islamic territory and not doubting that he would conquer it with the easiest of fighting because of the great multitude of his following and the abundance of his money and equipment. In Damascus, word of the defeat of the French and German armies in Asia Minor bolstered the confidence of the Muslim population. One chronicler from Damascus noted that this news convinced the Damascenes that the invasion of the Franks would fail. Jonathan Riley Smith writes, "It must be stressed that although for most of his march Louis had been leading his army through a region supposedly under Byzantine control, it had received little support from the population, the government, or its officers, and the survivors can only have remembered the frustration and broken promises. A recent historical judgment is that Manuel's fear of the French was so great that he connived at their destruction. The French had been distrustful of the Byzantines before they had left France. Their experiences in the Balkans and Asia Minor had borne out the complaints of their predecessors and left them with an abiding bitterness." Meanwhile, in Damascus, spirits were bolstered by news of the victories of Sultan Masud over the Crusaders in Asia Minor. The Damascus chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi records, "Fresh reports of their losses and the destruction of their numbers were constantly arriving until the end of the year, with the result that men were restored to some degree of tranquility of mind and began to gain some confidence in the failure of their enterprise, and their former distress and fear were alleviated in spite of the repeated reports of the activities of the Franks." After a 3-day voyage, Louis, Eleanor, and the other high-ranking French reached the port of St. Simeon in the Principality of Antioch on March 19, 1148. At last, the king had arrived in the Crusader states. For months, the Latin Christians of the Crusader states had waited patiently for the arrival of vast reinforcements under the rulers of France and Germany. Instead, Louis VII and a remnant of his great army showed up at Antioch in the spring of 1148. The bulk of the crusading forces, both French and German, had either deserted or perished in Asia Minor. King Louis and Queen Eleanor were welcomed by the ruler of the Principality of Antioch, Raymond of Poitiers. Raymond was a most gracious host to the king and queen, showing them every hospitality. Raymond was eager to secure the aid of the King of France in extending his own frontier to the east, and so he was motivated to make the king and his entourage feel particularly welcome. Queen Eleanor was delighted by the lavish social life at Antioch. Raymond was Eleanor's uncle, and his court, abounding in music and color, reminded Eleanor of her beloved Aquitaine. Later, Eleanor's political enemies would claim that she'd broken her marriage vows at Antioch by engaging in illicit affairs, but there's no evidence to support this. What inspired later French chroniclers to heap her with so much slander was the fact that she and Louis would ultimately divorce and Eleanor would marry Henry II of England, thus empowering the great rival of the King of France. In reality, all evidence indicates that Eleanor simply relished the poetry and lively social occasions at Antioch. The idea that Queen Eleanor, constantly surrounded by her ladies, royal guards, and other attendants, would have had occasion to engage in adultery is itself rather fanciful and says more about modern fantasies than medieval realities. Antioch was a splendid and wealthy city. One wonders if Louis felt any guilt at abandoning his men to continue the dangerous march overland while he relaxed amid Antioch's luxuries. Together, Louis and Raymond discussed the next move for the crusade. Edessa had been demolished by Nur ad-Din and was no longer a viable goal. But, Raymond explained, the Zengids were now entrenched in civil conflict. Nur ad-Din, ruler of Aleppo, was quarreling with his brother Saif ad-Din, prince of Mosul. Now was the perfect time for the Crusaders to launch a campaign to conquer the strategically crucial city of Aleppo. Raymond and Louis were very different men. Raymond was tall, handsome, and dashing, a natural military man steeped in the chivalric ideals of Aquitaine. Louis was pious, austere, and withdrawn. There is a popular idea that clash of personalities explains why Louis declined to join Raymond in a campaign against Aleppo. But Christopher Tyerman points out that strategic realities most likely determined Louis's decision. Louis had a substantial force of knights with him, but he'd abandoned his infantry and support staff in Asia Minor. Such forces would have been essential to reduce a stronghold like Aleppo. Meanwhile, the king knew that fresh Crusader forces were currently arriving by sea farther south at the ports of Tyre and Acre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Essentially, Louis would have to go to where the troops were. He would have to go to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, in effect, to rebuild his army. This accorded with Louis's personal preferences. As a pious man, he was deeply interested in visiting the Holy City. Thus, it's no surprise that Louis announced he would depart for Jerusalem with his forces. This is where tensions erupted between the king and queen. Raymond made his case to his niece, and Eleanor wanted to support her relative. Eleanor went so far as to proclaim that unless Louis joined her uncle's campaign, she would seek an annulment of their marriage. This was only the first great rupture in what had been a long simmering discontent between Louis and Eleanor. Louis worshipped his beautiful, extravagant wife, but the queen found her monkish, drab husband unappealing. But even this outburst was too much for the mild Louis to tolerate. He placed the queen under house arrest and departed Antioch for Palestine. By the time Louis reached Jerusalem, Conrad, recovered from his illness, was already there as well. With Conrad was a substantial army of fresh mercenaries. Crusaders arriving from Provence, as well as veterans from the conquest of Lisbon, were showing up by ship around this time as well. Combined with the local forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusade's strength was greatly replenished. Christopher Tyerman argues that despite the distractions, defeats, desertions, and high casualties, the Western forces that gathered in Outremer in the spring of 1148 constituted easily the largest Christian army to arrive in Outremer since 1097 through 1099. That is, since the First Crusade. However, this may still have been a fairly small army. Historians Emily Babcock and A.C. Cray argue that the army that besieged Damascus was not a very large one, probably no larger than the one which had attempted the same task 20 years before. Here, Babcock and Cray are referencing Baldwin II's army that besieged Damascus in 1129, which contained around 2,000 knights and 10,000 infantry. Interestingly, this is about the size of the army of the First Crusade when it besieged Jerusalem in 1099. It contained about 13,000 men in total. This gives us a good idea of the size of the army that assembled in Jerusalem in the summer of 1148. On June 24, 1148, Louis and Conrad joined the teenage King Baldwin III of Jerusalem and his mother, Queen Melisande, for a council to discuss the Crusade's next move. Most of the magnates of Jerusalem endorsed a campaign against Damascus. The Emir Unar of Damascus had formerly been an ally to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, but recently Unar had opted to forge an alliance with Nur ad-Din of Aleppo instead. In fact, Nur ad-Din had recently married Unar's daughter. It made sense to try and prevent the powerful Zengids from bringing Damascus fully under their control. The conquest of Damascus would solidify Frankish power in southern Syria and northern Palestine. It would provide the Kingdom of Jerusalem with the natural frontier of the eastern desert and effectively split the Muslim world in two, cutting off Egypt from Zengid Syria. Louis and Conrad were convinced. Damascus would be the next target of the Second Crusade. In hindsight, many commentators have criticized the decision to besiege Damascus. Some today still mistakenly believe that the Crusaders were attacking an ally. But the alliance between Damascus and Jerusalem had already collapsed, and the Emir Unar of Damascus had struck a new alliance with Nur ad-Din. But opinions were divided within Damascus, and powerful figures within the city remained hostile to the Zengids. The Templars and other leading figures in the Kingdom of Jerusalem may have had contact with treacherous elements within the city, and this may be why they felt that Damascus could be taken quickly. It made sense to try and capitalize on the discord within Damascus before the city was brought firmly under the control of the powerful Zengid dynasty. Meanwhile, the Emir Unar of Damascus prepared for war. Rumors had been circulating since the spring that the crusade would likely be directed against Damascus, and so he had considerable time to prepare. He summoned local Arab tribes to join with his own army and alerted the governors of frontier provinces. He also posted scouts on the roads to Damascus and dispatched men to cut off or divert water supplies on the route that would be taken by the Crusaders. Most importantly, he secured the help of the Zengid rulers, Saif ad-Din and Nur ad-Din, who put aside their civil conflict and organized their Askar troops and armies within days of receiving Unar's appeal. Everything about the planning for the attack on Damascus indicates that the Crusaders anticipated a rapid campaign. They believed that the city would either surrender quickly or be overwhelmed by a swift assault. The Christian army, led by Louis VII of France, Conrad III of Germany, and Baldwin III of Jerusalem, mustered at Tiberias in mid-July, uniting around the relic of the True Cross, the kingdom's most prized standard. They then struck out for Damascus, arriving before the city on the 24th. The Christians approached the city from the west, where grew immense orchards watered by the Barata River. These orchards were useful both defensively and as a source of provisions for the army. Plus, the river would provide the besieging forces with abundant water. Initially, the local forces of Damascus tried to hold the orchards, but the Crusaders attacked and pushed them out. The city's cavalry forces now made a stand at the Barata River, but the Christians attacked under the leadership of Conrad III. The German knights fought in a tight formation on foot, drove the Muslim forces back, and secured control of the Barata River. The Christians were now well positioned to launch an assault, but after 2 days of attacks, the city did not fall. News arrived that both Nur ad-Din and his brother Saif ad-Din were approaching with their armies for the relief of Damascus. William of Tyre claims that at this point, the Crusaders moved their camp to the eastern side of the city, since the defensive walls here were weaker. However, Emily Babcock and A.C. Cray point out that William of Tyre was writing much later and was not a witness to these events. Ibn al-Qalanisi, the Damascus chronicler, was present in the city at the time, and his account is the best and most accurate for the siege, and he does not describe the Crusaders shifting the location of their camp. Babcock and Cray explain, "None of the Arab writers mention such a shift of the Christian camp. Qalanisi, the best authority on the siege, gives a day-by-day description of the battles from Saturday to Thursday, with a statement of the location. According to him, the Christians remained in the same general area until the day they withdrew from the siege entirely. On the 4th day of the siege, the Crusaders found themselves dealing with increasingly stiff resistance." Babcock and Cray note that Muslims summoned by letter were arriving in constantly increasing numbers. The Crusaders had gambled on a quick conquest, but resistance within Damascus had proved more stubborn than expected. Ultimately, the approach of Nur ad-Din and Saif ad-Din with large Zengid armies left the Crusaders with no option but to withdraw. After only a 4-day siege, the Christian army retreated in good order at dawn on July 28 back to Jerusalem. Given the circumstance, the Christian leaders had no other option. To remain would have risked annihilation. The siege of Damascus had failed. Although the Crusader forces remained intact, they nevertheless achieved nothing. Once the Christian army returned to Jerusalem, the crusade at last unraveled. Conrad departed on September 8, sailing for Thessalonica and then arriving again in Constantinople. Once more, the German emperor was entertained by the Byzantine emperor. Now fully reconciled, Conrad and Emmanuel discussed plans to once and for all destroy their mutual enemy, Roger II of Sicily. Louis VII remained in Palestine until Easter of 1149. From France, Abbot Suger kept writing to his king, asking him to return. But Louis was determined to remain in the Holy Land until he could at least do some good for the Crusader kingdom. Eleanor was kept under armed guard, but she was now determined to end her marriage as soon as she was back in Europe. Indeed, this is part of what kept the French party in Palestine, for Louis hoped to convince his wife not to seek an annulment before they sailed home. It's clear from his correspondence that Louis was convinced that the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel Comnenus, had played a key role in the failure of the Second Crusade. In fact, when the king was returning home on Sicilian ships, he was detained by a Byzantine fleet. The Byzantines very nearly arrested Louis himself. Eleanor of Aquitaine, traveling on other ships, was also detained for a time by the Byzantine navy. By the time Louis arrived in Italy, his experience over the past 2 years had brought him around to the view of Roger II of Sicily. The two monarchs began to discuss a new crusade, this time directed against the Byzantines. The failure before Damascus brought an end to the Second Crusade in the Eastern Levant. When the Christian coalition returned to Jerusalem, there was a brief discussion about launching a campaign to take Ascalon. Conrad III waited, but few agreed to participate in another offensive. After a week, the German emperor departed for the west, harboring bitter feelings toward the nobility of the Latin East. Having led the largest army, Conrad had lost the most during the crusade. His nephew, Frederick, the future Frederick Barbarossa, had been with him throughout the long, horrific experience, and as future events would reveal, took many lessons from it. Frederick, one day, as emperor himself, would lead his own crusade, and his march across Anatolia would be impeccable. Indeed, in 1190, during the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa would crush the Seljuk Turks on the battlefield numerous times, and then dictate terms to them after capturing their capital city of Iconium. Frederick wasn't alone in taking valuable lessons from the experience. Second Crusade had very much been Bernard of Clairvaux' project, and he'd emphasized the role of God's providence. Future crusaders like Barbarossa and Richard the Lionheart would tend to the spiritual side of the campaign, but would be particularly meticulous in seeing to the organization of their armies, making arrangements for supplies and maintaining their independence from rulers encountered along the way. Barbarossa was particularly wary of the Byzantines, and during his crusade he would face outright treachery from a collapsing Byzantine regime. But in Barbarossa's case, it wouldn't matter very much, for his well-oiled, powerful army would dominate the Byzantines easily. Conrad's brother, the Bishop Otto of Freising, tried to see a silver lining in the whole miserable experience, recalling, "Although it was not good for the enlargement of boundaries or for the advantage of bodies, yet it was good for the salvation of souls." Although a failed crusader, Louis VII returned to the West with his reputation enhanced. In a society in which crusading had become the ideal, the king was admired for having taken up God's work in the Holy Land, suffering along with Christ in Palestine. His authority as king was magnified as well, as was his relationship with the princely houses of Champagne and Flanders. In 1150, Louis even discussed launching another crusade to aid the East, but this came to nothing. As an old man, the king was often heard to swear by the saints of Bethlehem. Across Christendom, there was much sorrow over the outcome of the Holy Land campaign. Even in the Iberian Peninsula, where the crusade had been a universal success, many were saddened by the terrible defeats suffered in the east. Some churchmen criticized the enterprise, accusing its leaders of arrogance, immorality, and rapacity. But were men like Louis VII and Conrad III less morally upright than the heroes of the First Crusade? Pope Eugenius III stated that the failure in the East had caused, quote, the most severe injury of the Christian name that God's church has suffered in our time. A later pope, Hadrian IV, probably got to the heart of the matter when he criticized Louis VII for undertaking the crusade, quote, with little caution. If Louis VII and Conrad III were guilty of anything, it was failing to plan exhaustively. They organized large, splendid armies, but failed to take steps toward maintaining discipline and unity, or toward ensuring the steady flow of supplies. Both rulers had to rely on Manuel Comnenus, who proved to be a poor ally. Later, Richard the Lionheart and Frederick Barbarossa would both lay out meticulous codes of conduct for their armies, and then enforce them strictly. In Richard's case, he organized and controlled his own fleet. Both men exercised such effective leadership over their armies that they were capable of subduing questionable allies in Sicily or in Byzantium, and Richard even conquered his own supply base at Cyprus. It's hard to imagine either Louis or Conrad showing such resourcefulness. Bernard of Clairvaux came under particular criticism, though his reputation for holiness remained intact. The saint issued a defense of he and the Pope's crusade policy, De Consideratione, between 1149 and 1152. Not surprisingly, Bernard pointed to sin as the main cause of the crusade's failure, but he also acknowledged the finality of divine judgment, impenetrable to the minds of men. He compared the whole affair to the disobedient Hebrews of the Old Testament wandering in the wilderness, casting himself and Pope Eugenius as Aaron and Moses, doing God's work, however difficult. I would rather that men murmur against us than against God, wrote the abbot. It would be well for me if he deigns to use me for his shield. Otto of Freising points out that the memory of the Eastern campaign lingered long throughout Christendom and cooled enthusiasm for Holy Land crusades for at least a generation. He wrote, "So great was the disaster of the army and so inexpressible the misery that those who took part bemoan it with tears to this very day." Although there would not be another major crusade launched to the east until Jerusalem itself fell in 1187, the Holy Land continued to concern the West's Christian rulers. Popes continued to call for new crusades, though the response from the 1150s through the early 1180s was generally tepid. Louis VII and Henry II of England would raise substantial funds to be sent to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In truth, however, the Crusader states did not enter a period of decline. Although the county of Edessa had been lost, the Kingdom of Jerusalem grew in strength and wealth, conquering Ashkelon in 1153. New castles were raised on the frontier, in part from funds provided by the monarchs of France and England. The Templars and Hospitallers continued to attract large endowments and deployed increasingly strong military forces in Palestine. By 1170, the Latin East was flourishing and holding its own against the challenge of its powerful neighbors. Crusading continued to evolve and become more prominent on the northern front, as well as in the Iberian Peninsula. The rulers of Spain and Portugal established their own military orders, and crusaders continued to join the Iberian kings in their regular campaigns against the Moors. The Second Crusade produced wildly mixed results, but as a whole, it provides a striking picture of Latin Christendom in the middle of the 12th century. Here was a civilization undeniably on the rise. Now, the increasingly wealthy, well-equipped kings of France and Germany were leading substantial offensives into the seats of empire in the East. The Second Crusade also demonstrates the increasing religious unity of Latin Europe. The religious unity amounted in many ways to a certain political unity, expressing itself in an almost continent-wide joint enterprise. From Portugal to the Slavic northeast, Italy to England, the Christian world took up the same cause, France and Germany acting in concert. Divisions still existed, and wars within Latin Christendom would remain a regular reality, but the unity of the Second Crusade is remarkable, and in some ways is the product of the triumphant First Crusade. The First Crusade had also brought Latin Christendom together. This would continue through the High Middle Ages, throughout the age of crusading. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out Blinkist, the app that enables you to understand the most important things from over 5,500 nonfiction books and podcasts in just 15 minutes. Click my link in the description to get 25% off Blinkist Premium and enjoy 2 memberships for the price of 1.
I know we've